The name of our lesson today is Faithful to God in Babylon. God rewards those who choose to follow His ways. Today we begin the second unit of lessons. The book of Daniel investigates 5 key events from the lives of Daniel and his companions. A 10-day sleep test, interpreting a king's dream, surviving a fiery furnace, interpreting handwriting on the wall, and surviving a lion's den. What does it mean to be a believer in the midst of an unbelieving world? How can we live out our faith when Christians are not in positions of influence or power? How can we remain faithful to God when our culture is influenced by other religions and systems of belief? Throughout history, Christians have struggled with this dilemma. The book of Daniel addresses these questions and more. Daniel speaks to the challenge of being in the world but not of the world. The Old Testament tells of many righteous people besides Daniel who remain faithful to God, though oppressed and opposed by the powers of this world. For example, Enoch and Noah walked with God in the midst of a corrupt and evil society, and Abraham lived by faith among the unbelieving Canaanites. In Daniel's time, devoted Israelites such as Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and Ezekiel remained true to God even though they were snatched out of their homes and taken as captives into Babylon. Daniel also experienced the Babylonian exile, where he and the Jewish people suffered 70 years of hardship. They lost their land and their liberty. They were robbed of their rights, and they struggled to survive under the rule of Babylonian tyrants. The book of Daniel can be summarized in 2 words: miracles and mysteries. The first part of Daniel, chapters 1 through 6, contains miracle stories about Daniel and his Hebrew friends, in which the kings of Babylon threatened to bring the faithful Jews to an end. In each case, however, God overruled the human rulers and amazing interventions that protected the Hebrews. The second part of the book, chapters 7 through 12, contains visions of the end that reveal mysteries of God's present and future sovereign rules. The visions show that just as God ruled over the life and times of Daniel, God continues to rule over earthly kingdom. Ultimately, God will bring all human kingdoms to an end, and he will establish his eternal kingdom ruled by Jesus Christ. Our lessons in this unit will focus on the first half of the book. Through the stories of Daniel and his friends in Babylon, we will discover the timely truth that God strengthens his people so they can remain steadfast under pressure. Like Daniel, we can resist the temptations to compromise our faith. Like Daniel, we can shine as lights in this world's darkness. History. The book of Daniel recounts events spanning from Babylonian King Nebuchadnezzar, initial conquest of Jerusalem in 605 BC, to the 3rd year of the Persian King Cyrus, reigned in 536 BC, covering Judah's 70-year exile in Babylon. Daniel, who was believed to have been with Jeremiah's upper class, was selected for exile as Nebuchadnezzar sought out people of noble standing among subjugated population. This prestigious status features prominently in the narrative indicating Daniel's far-reaching influence and esteemed position, as the account covers a pivotal era in biblical history and the ancient geopolitics of the Near East. Overview. The first chapter of the book of Daniel follows the plight of 4 young Jewish men exiled to Babylon, who resisted religious culture assimilation despite intense pressure to do so. Determined to uphold their Jewish religious vows as much as possible, they chose not to eat the royal food provided, adhering instead to a diet consistent with their faith. Their commitment led to a remarkable health and vitality, set them apart from those around them. Their loyalty was rewarded by God with outstanding wisdom, understanding, and skills, surpassing all their peers and earning high recognition in the royal court. This lesson emphasizes the power of unwavering faithfulness. Introduction. Think about one of the most difficult challenges you have ever faced. What about the most challenging moments our nation has endured? These questions invite deep reflection, but for sheer adversity, few can surpass Judah's plight at the beginning of the book of Daniel. Attacked by Babylon, Judah eventually fell when Jerusalem destroyed. The weak and poor were left behind or killed, while Babylon took Judah's nobles and treasures hundreds of miles away. Despite this grim reality, the story highlights the unwavering faith of 4 young men, and above all, God's unparalleled faithfulness to them. It serves as a powerful reminder that even in the darkest times, God's intervention on behalf of his people can shine through. Okay, part 1 of the lesson, exiled to a pagan society, exiled to Babylon. And this comes from Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasured house of his God. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel, and some of the king's descendants, and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. The book of Daniel is an excellent example of why it is important to understand the Bible's place within history. The first chapter of Daniel is an introduction to the whole book. It tells us about Daniel and his friends and explains why they were exiled in Babylon. The first 2 verses reveal the historical background of the story. The time was the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, which was 605 BC. In those days, the prophet Jeremiah was warning Judah's leaders, priests, and people that their unfaithfulness would bring God's judgment in the form of Babylonian invasion. But they did not believe his warnings. The first invasion took place in 605 BC. This was followed by a second in 597 and a third in 587. Nebuchadnezzar, who had recently defeated Egypt in battle, laid siege to Jerusalem. Jerusalem fell during the 3rd invasion along with the destruction of the temple in 586. The full story of Nebuchadnezzar's attack and victory is told in 2 Kings 24. Judah's king Jehoiakim had no choice but to surrender, because God had withdrawn his protection from Judah, and had given the victory to Nebuchadnezzar. The Lord could have saved Jerusalem as he had done many times in the past, but the time for judgment had arrived. God had warned Israel repeatedly that judgment was coming unless they repented of their idolatry and returned wholeheartedly to the Lord of their God. When Jerusalem surrendered, Nebuchadnezzar entered the city and robbed the temple of its gold and silver vessels, and he carried them to Babylon. He placed the vessels in the treasury of his god, which was probably the Babylonian god Nabu, given that the name Nebuchadnezzar means Nabu, protect my son, or Nabu, protect the boundary. The act of robbing the temple of its treasures was Nebuchadnezzar's way of displaying his superiority over the God of Israel. 18 years later, he would return to Jerusalem and burn the city and the temple. Ironically, he was completely unaware he was only an instrument in God's hand, and that he would be humbled by the very God whose temple he had robbed. When compared to the defeat of Jerusalem and the exile of its people, the loss of the temple vessels might appear insignificant. However, the mention of the temple vessels foreshadows the events of Daniel 5, where these same vessels play an important role in the story of Belshazzar's feast and his ultimate demise. According to 2 Kings 24, Nebuchadnezzar not only took the gold and silver vessels from the temple, but he also captured leading citizens, princes, craftsmen, and priests, and carried them away to Babylon. Among those captives were Daniel and his friends. They are introduced in Daniel chapter 1, verse 3a as children of Israel, and they are further described in verse 4a as young men. As captives in a foreign land, Daniel and his companions are thrust into the service of Nebuchadnezzar. Their family histories are unknown, but in verse 3b, they are some of the king's descendants, or some of the nobles. Therefore, they have been accustomed to lives of privilege and comfort, but now they must accept a lifestyle of humble service to a foreign king. The young men were under the authority of Ashpenaz, master of the king's eunuchs. In this context, in verse 4a, the Hebrew word translated eunuch, which is saris, signifying a palace official. Ashpenaz was the highest of these court officers. In verse 3c, the word translated master is Rab, which is used throughout the book of Daniel with the meanings great, chief, or head. Therefore, Ashpenaz was chief of staff or chief of court officials. The Babylonian king instructed Ashpenaz to identify the most promising candidates for inclusion in the royal court. The king wanted only the best and brightest young men to work in the palace. In verse 4b, they must be handsome in appearance with no blemish but good looking, and they must be highly gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand. The words wisdom, knowledge, and understanding are significant throughout the book of Daniel. The words wise and wisdom are found 25 times in Daniel. The word understanding appears 23 times. Gifted is used 10 times, and knowledge appears 9 times. In verse 4c, the most impressive candidates will be taught the language and literature of the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans were the most prominent ethnic group in Babylon. However, the word Chaldeans is also used as a name for the magicians and diviners who explain mysteries and cast spells. It encompasses all of the categories of wise men in Babylon. For the Hebrews, to learn their language and literature means they will be indoctrinated in the Babylonian culture, worldview, and religion, which include forbidden occult practices. This forced assimilation raises questions about the challenges faced by believers in a secular world. Will the young Hebrews be able to retain their faith in God and their unique identity as Israelites? In verse 5, the initial educations of the Hebrew youth would last for 3 years. At that point, they would enter the king's service. The king wanted his servants to be strong and healthy. Therefore, during their training period, the young men were given the best food and drink that Babylon had to offer. It was the same food and wine enjoyed by the king himself. As the account of Daniel proceeds, we see how God worked through these 4 young men in Babylonian captivity. The next part is 4 young men chosen, and this comes from 1 Samuel 6 and 7. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. With the historical setting in place, the account turns to 4 faithful Hebrew men chosen by Nebuchadnezzar and ultimately by God, who would figure promptly in the scriptures. In verse 6, we are introduced to Daniel and his 3 friends as young Hebrews chosen to be trained as servants in Babylon's king. They stood out because of their exceptional faith in and faithfulness to God during difficult times. As was often the custom, these 4 exiled captives were given foreign names. Daniel, meaning God is my judge, was renamed Belshazzar. Hananiah, meaning the Lord is gracious, was named Shadrach. Mishael, meaning who belongs to God, was named Meshach. And Azariah, meaning the Lord has helped, was named Abednego. These names are significant because the Hebrew names testify to the one true God, while the Babylonian names allude to pagan deities. In a sense, these names foreshadow the conflict that will take place between pagan powers and the God of Israel, who is repeatedly triumphant throughout the book. The alteration of the names of Daniel and his friends also represented a kind of transformation, but a negative one. It reflected Babylon's deliberate effort to redefine their identities, to sever the ties with their heritage, and to impose a new cultural imprint. The act served as a symbolic erasure of their past and an imposition of a foreign identity upon them. A summary of part 1. While our world today is far removed from ancient Babylon, the similarities are surpassing. As we explore the upcoming chapters of Daniel, we'll discover the danger of pride, the challenges of remaining faithful to God, and the value of following his guidance. These timeless lessons provide practical wisdom for the struggles we face. Over the next few weeks, as we dive into the stories of these 4 Hebrew men, be on the lookout for parallels to what Christians experience in today's increasingly secular society. Their journey offers insight that still resonate in our lives today. Part 2, faithfulness to God tested, we will not be defiled. And this comes from 1 Daniel chapter 1, verses 8 through 14. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you were in danger of my head before the king. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let your appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies. And as you see fit, so deal with your servants. So he consented with them in this matter and tested them 10 days. Why would these 4 men refuse to consume food and drink from the king's table? There are 2 likely reasons. First, some of the choice foods of ancient Babylon, such as pork, violated the Jewish dietary laws. Even foods that were otherwise clean would not have been prepared in kosher fashion, with the blood drained from them as required by the law. Eating these foods would have made Daniel and his friends ceremonially unclean before God by violating his commands. Second, most of this food and drink would have been offered to pagan gods beforehand. So eating it would have been indirect participation in pagan ritual worship. In verses 10 through 14, Daniel, acting as the spokesperson for the 4 men, asked that they be allowed to honor their dietary practices, causing some pushback. The king's official immediately voiced his concerns, which were rooted in fear of King Nebuchadnezzar, who could be brutal and demanding. If the king noticed the Hebrews looking malnourished, he would know that they were not eating well. Daniel faced a dilemma. Refusing the food was an insult to the king that could cause problems from demotion to punishment. Moreover, the other exiles may have pressured Daniel to relent for the good of them all. After all, this was the best food of the kingdom, and Jerusalem and the temple, which was not yet destroyed, were hundreds of miles away. Still, Daniel and his friends would not compromise. Instead, he proposed a test in which they would consume only vegetables and water for 10 days. Afterward, if they looked well, they would be allowed to continue the diet. In verse 9, the official assigned to them had compassion and even affection for the 4 men. Even so, Daniel's proposition would have been difficult to accept. Although in verse 14 he would have preferred that the 4 men eat from the king's table, the official allowed them to proceed with their proposed test. Next part of the lesson is healthier than the rest, and this comes from Daniel chapter 1, verses 15 and 16. And at the end of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine that they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. 10 days later, the test concluded with irrefutable results. In verse 15, God's favor upon Daniel and his friends became clear, as they appeared fatter and fairer in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meal. The phrase fatter in flesh is a Hebrew expression that meant they looked healthier than all the others. While vegetables are certainly healthy food in themselves, and a vegetarian diet can be healthy, the message here is that God intervenes supernaturally on their behalf. Ashpenaz, the supervisor of the eunuchs, had not expected to discover their healthy appearance. In a predominantly agrarian society, except for fish in coastal areas, meat was uncommon in the diet of most ancient people, with only the rich routinely eating it, especially choice meat. Therefore, those who ate the king's diet could easily be compared to general population, with those eating royal food appearing healthier. This account is the first of several that demonstrate God's care, favor, and intervention upon his faithful followers in Babylon. Those who observed them, fellow exiles, the king and the king's officials, would see that the one true, all-powerful God was acting on their behalf. In this case, they will be permitted to continue eating and thriving with a diet consistent with God's commands. Commitment to God is always the best decision and is rewarded by Him. Summary of part 2. As the world becomes increasingly secular and hostile to Christianity, we as Christians face growing challenges in staying true to our faith. Beliefs and values that were once clear and accepted are now questioned, criticized, or even outright opposed. This shift invites more profound reflection on what it means to hold onto Christian convictions in a changing cultural landscape. We can draw inspiration from the lives of 4 men who offer valuable lessons about living out our faith in God. Their stories remind us how to balance steadfast belief with the complexities of modern life. Part 3, God rewards faithfulness, understanding wisdom and ability. This comes from 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 17. As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Daniel and his friends had been taken to Babylon in Mesopotamia as exiles, far from the promised land, to dwell in a hostile pagan land. They were supremely faithful to the Lord and careful to observe His commands, very likely more faithful than any of the other exiles. They served in positions of honor and influence in the shadow of the great king Nebuchadnezzar. And God was with these men, protecting them and enabling them for what was a special purpose within the plan of God for His people. Against this backdrop, verse 17 identifies 3 distinct gifts that God had given them in preparation for what was emerging as their role in the ongoing purposes of God. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. Each of these gifts, knowledge, skill, and wisdom, is distinct and important, working together to equip these 4 for their mission. The word knowledge coupled with wisdom referred to both intellectual acuity and practical living. Why would they need such knowledge? They had been forcibly moved from Judah to Mesopotamia, a strange and foreign place. Therefore, being able to think through and live within these circumstances, especially in the court of the king, would be critical. It would typically take years to develop such knowledge and wisdom, yet God gifted it to them. Related to knowledge is skill, referring to insight and ability that brings success and prosperity in one's endeavors. Being skilled generally is the result of study and training, but in this case, God enabled these men to have this skill at the beginning of their service to the king. Although often thought of as a spiritual virtue, wisdom is also practical in the biblical content. Wisdom has been defined in part as understanding the nature of the world and one's place and purpose in it. Wisdom is knowledge used in its most effective way with proper discernment. In addition, Daniel was granted the ability to understand visions and dreams. In the ancient world, such an ability was seen as giving a person special access to or understanding of divine works in the world. In the upcoming chapters of Daniel, this God-given ability is critical to survival and success. Last part is 10 times more capable. This comes from 1 Samuel 18 to 21. Now, at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all hour which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the musicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. At the end of their 3-year education, all the young trainees were brought before King Nebuchadnezzar to be examined. Because of God's special gifting, Daniel and his friends were recognized as superior to all the other young men. In verse 19, the king spoke with them personally, and he examined them in matters of wisdom and understanding. In verse 20, not only did the 4 Hebrews exceed their peers, they also proved to be 10 times better than all the king's professional advisors who were already working in the kingdom. These advisors were called magicians and astrologers. Magicians were priests skilled in interpreting dreams. Astrologers interpreted a variety of signs in the stars, and they conjured spells to influence the future. The first episode in Daniel's story concludes with an affirmation of Daniel's long service in the Babylonian royal court. The historical note in verse 21 is key. Daniel continued even into the first year of King Cyrus. These gifts and assignments were not short-term. Daniel would outlive Nebuchadnezzar, and his reign survived into the reign of King Cyrus, beginning around 535 BC, when Daniel will be around 90 years old. Truly, God was in this situation. Summary of part 3. Daniel 1 reminds us of how God shows his faithfulness during rough times, offering hope and assurance. Daniel and his friends faced challenges that resonate with our own struggles, yet God was always there, guiding and providing for them. This chapter isn't just about reflecting on the past, it's also a reminder to trust God with our future. He's always working, and that gives us something to look forward to. As you think about the blessings in your life, let those moments spark gratitude and fill you with hope for what's ahead, knowing that through Christ great things are yet to come. Closing. Hearing and studying the story of Daniel affects us in many ways. We grieve with Daniel in his captivity, but we rejoice with him when he receives the blessings of God. Also, we are grateful for the faithfulness of God that is displayed in his book's first chapter. Although God brings judgment, he remains loyal to his people. The ultimate goal of his judgment is redemption. Like Daniel, we may find ourselves under pressure to conform to non-Christian attitudes and behaviors. Therefore, in light of Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through 21, we must commit ourselves to resist the temptations of the enemy and refuse to compromise when placed under pressure. We must trust God to make a way for us, to open doors, and to work miracles on our behalf. We must rest in the knowledge that God is in control of our lives and our circumstance and our future. We must emulate Daniel's example. Thank you, and come again next